In front of me are two A2 adventure bikes for less than 6,500 euros, and yet they have some major differences and are also aiming in different directions. Which one offers the better value for money? That's what we're going to find out today. The KTM 390 Adventure X is one of those new motorcycles that, when it arrived on the market last year, hardly anyone really cared about anymore. The off-road purist, the 390 Adventure R, overshadowed everything in that direction, or at least everything in the KTM lineup. And for the Adventure X, somehow there wasn't much attention left. But actually, especially when you look at its price, it becomes quite interesting. For just under 5,700 euros, you already get this kind of adventure bike in Germany, and in Austria it's just under 6,400. That means it's not only significantly cheaper than the R version, it also moves into a completely different price class where other comparisons suddenly make sense. The CFMOTO 450MT, in terms of character and its general layout, or let's say the niche it wants to ride in, which is more off-road oriented, would actually be a very fitting rival for the KTM 390 Adventure R. But the CFMOTO is also available for 6,500 euros or even less. And that's why, between these two, the question becomes, which one is more worth putting your rather tight budget on the table for? And that's exactly what we're going to find out. But first, a very quick technical introduction. In the KTM, we've got a nearly 400 cubic centimeter single-cylinder engine producing 44 horsepower and 39 Newton meters of torque at maximum. In the CFMOTO, there's a larger engine for this small displacement class, namely a 449 cubic centimeter parallel twin, so noticeably bigger, but it's tuned more toward torque and therefore delivers slightly less power at 42 horsepower, while offering slightly more torque with 42 Newton meters. As for the bikes themselves, both are in principle typical adventure bikes, long suspension travel and all that. 200 millimeters front and rear, and yes, even this more road-focused X version of the 390 Adventure still comes with 200 millimeters of travel. The R version then goes all the way up to a massive 250 millimeters. Otherwise, there's a bit of a difference when it comes to vehicle weight. According to official figures, the KTM comes in at 176 kilograms ready to ride. The official number for the CFMOTO 450MT is 185 kilograms ready to ride. We measured the fully fueled CFMOTO 450MT at 196.5 kilograms, while the 390 Adventure R came in at just under 180 kilograms fully fueled. So this X version here will probably also sit somewhere around 180 kilograms or slightly below that, meaning there is definitely a noticeable weight difference between the two. The most obvious difference, the CFMOTO comes with proper adventure bike wheels and tires, 90/90 on a 21-inch front wheel and 140 on an 18-inch rear. Meanwhile, the KTM runs a 19-inch front and a 17-inch rear. When it comes to electronics, things are fairly basic overall, although KTM is even more basic. Simple LCD display, ABS only switchable between road mode and rear off, and according to KTM it's also supposed to have traction control, but in reality this bike here doesn't. The CFMOTO definitely has both ABS and traction control, and both can be deactivated very easily via a switch. I'd say enough about the data and facts. Let's move on to the different areas of use. Like on many tours, our testing begins in a rather less exciting way right in the city, and especially in Barcelona, traffic can be pretty brutal. Luckily, we escaped the city fairly quickly, but these are still bikes people buy for everyday use as well. Maybe for commuting to work, or because even on weekend rides you still have to battle your way through towns and villages. So this stuff is definitely relevant. Surprisingly, even though the CFMOTO looks much taller and more like a proper grown-up adventure bike compared to the 390 Adventure X, it's actually 5 millimeters lower. We've got an 820 millimeter seat height on the CFMOTO and 825 on the KTM. In reality, I find both bikes very manageable when it comes to maneuvering and slow speed riding. Both have a narrow waist, both make it easy to reach the ground, and both come with wide handlebars and a decent steering lock. That means filtering through traffic or maneuvering around isn't difficult on either of them. And both have very light clutches, which makes stop and go traffic or slow maneuvers noticeably easier and less tiring. So those are the similarities. Now for the differences. First of all, quick shifter. The KTM comes with one fitted, very practical, and it works surprisingly well and crisply. Even at low RPM, the CFMOTO stays more traditional here. Not really a big issue though, the feel at the shift lever and gearbox is genuinely good. The bigger difference is that the CFMOTO carries a larger tank, 17.5 liters, compared to only 14 liters on the KTM. And in addition, the CFMOTO simply feels taller overall, more like a full-size adventure bike. That also means it's slightly more top-heavy and a bit more tippy. The center of gravity sits higher, so if you've got shorter legs and need to lean the bike over a bit more when stopping, you definitely notice that. On the other hand, one advantage of the CFMOTO is that it definitely makes its presence known. The sound coming out of that stock engine, I honestly don't know how they managed to pass Euro 5+ regulations with it, but apparently they did, and that can actually be something you really enjoy. It has a proper nasty growl to it. It sounds like a much bigger displacement engine than what's actually installed. And especially in the city, at least here in Spain, that has an effect. Drivers here are generally used to two-wheelers filtering around them and usually make a bit of space instead of closing gaps like they often do back home. But with the CFMOTO, people notice you much earlier than on the KTM 390 Adventure X, simply because it's so much louder. Everyone kind of thinks, oof, what kind of big machine is coming through there, better make room. On the KTM, you almost disappear underneath the traffic in comparison. The KTM behaves much more restrained in the lower RPM range. That can have positive sides, easy to handle, neighborhood friendly, but also negative sides. Luckily, we escaped the city fairly quickly and got onto relaxed country roads and even some stretches of highway. And there, honestly, both bikes are really good. I can absolutely imagine doing longer tours on both of them. First point, low fuel consumption. Both consume very little. The CFMOTO slightly more. If you really hammer it, it's easier to push it above 4 liters. On the KTM, you really have to ride hard to get above 4 liters. If you ride normally, both stay below 4 liters, with the KTM tending more toward 3, even below 3.5 liters. So that's the first advantage. Second point, why I can imagine touring on them, the suspension. The CFMOTO is fully adjustable, the KTM isn't. Still on the KTM, at least for my body weight, I think they nailed the balance in the setup. It's comfortable enough, absorbs bumps willingly enough, manhole covers in the city, expansion joints on the highway, or rough asphalt and concrete roads, which you also often encounter. All of that gets absorbed nicely enough that your spine doesn't feel like it's getting smashed, but at the same time, when you hit a bump while leaned over, the bike doesn't start wobbling around. There's a good amount of composure in the chassis. The CFMOTO is similar. Maybe a touch softer overall, but also I'd say a touch more comfortable, especially when looking at the seat. Now, I wouldn't call either of these seats particularly premium, but on the KTM, my longest ride was only about an hour, which is honestly nothing. I still had the feeling that the seat compressed a little quicker than on the CFMOTO. As for ergonomics and riding position, I really can't complain on either bike. Both fit me very well. But I did notice a potential issue on the CFMOTO. When I'm sitting, my knees are just barely in front of this edge here. That means if you're taller than me, say 1.90 meters or above, you're probably going to run into that. That's not exactly ideal, but I'd say it only affects a fairly small group of riders who are actually that tall. What you don't need to be especially tall for, though, is to already notice the limits of the wind protection on both bikes. On both the CFMOTO and the KTM, at my height of 1.85 meters, the wind hits me pretty much right around nose level. That means you get fairly loud turbulence around the helmet and therefore not exactly the best comfort. If you're 1.75 meters or smaller, it probably won't bother you. But for taller riders, that's maybe another area where you'd want to upgrade. On the KTM, the screen also isn't adjustable. On the CFMOTO, at least you have the choice between bad wind protection and slightly less bad wind protection. There are also proper luggage solutions available for both bikes. both from the factory accessories catalog and from the aftermarket. Especially the CFMOTO 450MT is hugely popular by now in this whole off-road and adventure bubble. There are tons of luggage options for it already. And I also have to point out something positive. The 450MT comes with a luggage rack. That's always practical. Even without permanently mounted luggage systems, you can just throw a tail bag on there, even if you've got a passenger sitting on the back. On the KTM, things get a bit tighter in that regard. Speaking of passengers though, the CFMOTO may offer more space, but it only allows 175 kilograms of payload in addition to the bike's own weight before reaching the maximum permitted weight of 355 kilograms. Meanwhile, on the KTM, we almost have 290 kilograms available, assuming we trust the manufacturer's claimed ready-to-ride weight of 176 kilograms. So another point for the KTM. Alright, and finally we made it to the corners, and because the bikes run very different wheel and tire dimensions, I expected the biggest difference in cornering to come from the steering behavior. And yes, the KTM requires slightly less input. It feels a touch more planted in lean angle because we've simply got more rubber on the 100 width front tire than on the 90 width tire of the CFMOTO. On the CFMOTO, the narrower front feels a little softer, slightly vague. But honestly, not nearly as big of a difference as I expected. Both have typical adventure bike ergonomics and both prefer to be pushed into corners rather than aggressively flicked around. The suspension level is also fairly similar, I'd say, at least in the setups we had here. Those weren't really the big difference makers. The really big differences are here, in the engines. The engines are almost opposites in character. And paradoxically so, because this here is the torquey engine and that's the parallel twin. Meanwhile, the single-cylinder KTM is the rev-hungry one. On the KTM, below around 5,500 RPM, basically nothing happens. Even at full throttle, speed and revs only climb slowly. But once you get above that threshold, it suddenly pulls really nicely. It feels sporty, active, energetic, like proper power within the A2 class. But if you really want to ride quickly on a twisty road, you basically have to stay in the upper third of the rev range. The CFMOTO, on the other hand, first of all, apparently lots of people don't have a big issue with it, otherwise it wouldn't be selling like hotcakes. Personally though, what bothers me are the pretty noticeable throttle transitions that are difficult to smooth out, especially at lower RPM, especially on tight, twisty roads. You approach a tight, blind corner, slow the bike down, trail brake toward the apex, and then you pick up the throttle again. There's always this little jerk, and sometimes it messes up my line through the corner. For me personally, it just doesn't feel nice. That's one area where I think the 450MT absolutely needs refinement, but it's been like that from the beginning and still loads of people buy them, so apparently it's not a huge issue for most riders. But at the same time, once that throttle transition happens, the bike immediately pushes forward with a lot of torque. It almost feels like 80% or at least 2/3 of the available torque arrives instantly, which means revving it out doesn't really gain you all that much. You can let it spin a bit longer and enjoy the soundtrack from the rear. But from a pure engine character perspective, you can shift up relatively early and simply enjoy that torque push in the next gear. And on the KTM, it's exactly the opposite, and honestly I think the same opposite character also applies to the brakes. Because while the KTM has, in my opinion, a brake pressure point that's much too soft, you pull the lever very far and then need quite a lot of hand force to brake hard. The rear brake becomes very helpful, especially downhill when braking harder into corners. Meanwhile, on the 450MT, the brake feels almost instantly hard at the lever. But at the same time, not much actually happens. So here too, you need to squeeze hard. But the feeling at the lever makes you think you're braking much more aggressively than the bike is actually slowing down. On the KTM, it's the other way around. You feel like you're braking less than the bike actually is. Neither setup is ideal, both could be improved. And since both bikes had less than 100 kilometers on the odometer when we picked them up, some of that may still change over time. Also, neither issue is a massive problem because you can always fit different brake pads and fine-tune the braking behavior a bit. But in stock form, the way we received them here, neither braking setup is really perfect. We didn't pick up all this filth from some tiny puddle in front of a cafe. No, we actually let them eat some dust, and that's why both bikes are now proudly wearing a proper gravel patina. But how well the two of them perform off-road, I'm not the only one telling you that. I brought in some professional help for this part. Hello Bernd, great that you also made it to Spain to join us. For the people who don't know you, you're a Supermoto world champion. These days you earn your money with riding courses in all sorts of directions, with stunt shows and serious action on two wheels. So all the really wild shots, well, luckily we're already a bit easy to tell apart by the colors of our outfits, but also by riding style. Even if we looked exactly the same one-to-one, I think people would still recognize who the world champion is here and who isn't. But that's exactly why this is especially interesting. I don't think many world champions ride A2 motorcycles or A2 adventure bikes. But just from the few meters you've ridden now, what's your assessment? What stands out to you, especially when it comes to riding on loose terrain?
First of all, just briefly regarding the class, this is always described as an entry-level class, but I have to say very clearly, even as a very experienced rider, that you can really have proper fun with A2 engines. And sure, here we've ridden what you could call relatively easy terrain. I'd ride the same stuff on big machines with well over 1,000 cubic centimeters as well. But this is tremendous fun. They're agile, they ride well, and of course they're on a completely different price level. That's already interesting.
What do you say about the engines? Because I think they're quite different in character. The KTM engine is something I criticized quite strongly, especially regarding off-road riding, because there's barely anything happening low down. So for example, when it comes to braking traction, you're a master of drifting, but here you really have to give it a proper handful, right? And at the same time, with the CFMOTO, I feel like there's just more torque available. It doesn't need quite as much effort, even though paradoxically that's the twin cylinder and this is the single cylinder. How did it feel to you?
They definitely differ quite clearly, especially when you like riding dynamically. And for me, of course, it was about shots with drifting and things like that. You're already using the revs anyway. So the gap you just described wasn't actually that noticeable to me because I was keeping the engine nicely alive anyway. And through motorsport, you naturally develop a feel quite quickly for how to work around weaknesses and deliberately ride the engine in the rev range where you immediately notice, okay, now it really moves forward. So if you're in the right rev range, both bikes ride really well. But yes, I agree with you. When setting off the first time, it did stall on me right away on the slope. That's where, compared to the other bike, you do notice that a little easy torque is missing.
Now, if you think about it, we haven't ridden like this today, but in general, if you get into slightly more technical terrain, speeds get lower and you have to play more with the clutch and all that. Would that be a disadvantage for you if you know, okay, once the revs drop, the engine doesn't have much torque left? Or would you say, no, actually, if you have a bit of technique to deal with it, it's no problem?
If you have the technique, it's actually no problem. Because once you know the bike a little and you keep the vehicle slightly under tension, you can work around that quite well. But as I said, just jumping on and riding off and right away here on the slope, that's where you noticed it for the first time. While I was riding, even slowly through the forest, I'd say if you have good clutch feel, then it wasn't really annoying and it worked really well.
Good. So my main criticism of the KTM 390 has already been softened quite a bit by the professional. Maybe we'll find something else. Ergonomics, standing position. I'm 1.85 m, and for me, here on the 390 Adventure X, it already feels very hunched over. Not really a natural standing position where I feel comfortable or where I know how to move properly in a gravel corner. How was it for you?
Yes, that's definitely noticeable. The handlebar is clearly lower. I'm almost 10 centimeters shorter, so 1.76 m. For me, it was just about still okay. I'd say it was an aggressive position for riding fast. For that, it still worked. But a bike like this is more something where you say, okay, you ride from morning until evening. And there, in terms of standing position, you would probably definitely want to improve it with handlebar risers so you can keep riding in a more relaxed way. Here, from the beginning, you can see it when the bikes stand next to each other. The handlebar is clearly higher. You can simply ride more relaxed. And even if you're not really pushing hard, you still arrive safer and more relaxed.
But you did already push a little bit, so to speak. What do you say about the suspension? We actually have very comparable suspension travel, exactly the same length, 200 millimeters front and rear. But here one is not adjustable while the other is fully adjustable. And I also think there are big differences in the character of the suspension, right? Would you say something is missing? Some stability or, on the other hand, comfort in the non-adjustable suspension? Because on the CFMOTO you could still tweak it a bit, but on the KTM it is what it is. Where would you place it? More on the comfortable side or more on the sporty side?
I actually had more of a sporty impression. I have to say, it basically gave good feedback. The comfort aspect was completely missing for me now because I was only out for those few minutes or that half hour of action, let's say. And for that purpose, it basically worked. I didn't need much time to feel comfortable. And I had good feedback from the bike in general and from the suspension. So from that point of view, first impression, okay. But you also have to look at it objectively. I weigh just under 65 kilos, at least without riding gear. So if you bring a few more kilos to the scale, then I do think a bit of adjustment wouldn't hurt.
I think so too, but it's still interesting because at first glance you'd think, just like you said, when the bikes are standing next to each other, the CFMOTO is clearly the off-road machine. You almost don't even need to compare them, it already seems pointless. But there are a few details like suspension setup or spring feel or, for example, ground clearance. Here on the CFMOTO, the more off-road looking bike, we have 220 millimeters, and here on what I'd call the touring and city option, the 390 Adventure, we have 272 millimeters. So again, it's not quite as harmless as you might think, but of course the main difference and also the main limitation now in loose terrain are the wheels. Here we basically have road wheels, cast wheels, 90-10 tires on both, but the tire dimensions alone are different. Here we have 19 inches at the front, 100/90/19 at the front, and at the rear 130/80/17, I think, if I remember correctly. Meanwhile, on the CFMOTO, it's 90/90/21 at the front and 140/80/18 at the rear. Those are proper sizes where you can find real knobby tires and then really let it eat dust accordingly. Time to come to a conclusion. I think you get a lot for your money with both bikes. Adventure bikes are generally not cheap machines, even in the A2 class. And getting all of this for under 6,500 euros is already a pretty good thing. Secondly, in many areas, I think both deliver good to at least perfectly acceptable riding performance. Whether in the city, on the highway or on twisty roads, you never feel completely out of place on either of them. Yes, there are a few rough edges where things could be optimized, especially on the CFMOTO, which has already been on the market for 2 or 3 years now. Of course, its success proves them right, so maybe they don't feel that much motivation to change it. But I do think these small areas, especially the throttle transitions of the engine, could still be refined a bit, because then it would be an excellent bike. As it is, it's a very good one. And the Adventure X simply surprised me. After the Adventure R, which is basically the more prestigious model, I expected the Adventure X to be the one for smaller riders, a bit of plain home cooking, a bread and butter machine, not really exciting, not really great. That was my assumption beforehand, but I think you really shouldn't underestimate its adventure ambitions or its general riding performance. Asphalt, touring, old town traffic, it all makes sense and feels well thought out. And for the price, especially in Germany, at clearly under 6,000 euros, I think that's not a bad number at all. If I now have to decide which one offers the better value for money, then I'd say it's the CFMOTO 450MT. Simply because the 390 Adventure X is a good all-rounder, but doesn't really shine in any one specific area. The CFMOTO 450MT, on the other hand, brings enough all-round capability to be used well in the city, for touring and on asphalt, but off-road it still has a bit of a special position because it's rare for an A2 adventure bike to take off-road riding this seriously, to offer such good ergonomics for standing riding. And as you also heard from Bernd, he was actually pretty impressed by the machine as well. So it brings that one special discipline where it really shines, and that's something the KTM is missing a little bit. But maybe you see it completely differently. Let me know your opinion on these two motorcycles in the comments. Maybe there are some Adventure X owners or CFMOTO 450MT owners among you. Then feel free to share your long-term experiences with the community as well. Other than that, leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and hopefully we'll see each other again soon. Thanks for watching, take care, and bye-bye.